The bell shrieked through the hallway like a siren, and Jason flinched instinctively, clutching his crutches tighter beneath his arms. The world inside Jefferson High didn't move slower for anyone, least of all for someone like him, a black kid limping through the crowd, carrying not just the weight of his body, but the crushing expectations and judgments of everyone around him. His parrot, Orion, perched carefully inside a small, worn carrier strapped to his backpack, shifted nervously with every shove and sneer that came his way. Jason kept his head down, always down. That was how you survived here. Move quiet. Don't draw attention. Blend in, even though you never could. But the world had other plans. As he made his way toward the English classroom, the corridor seemed to narrow, the walls closing in like a trap. He could already feel the eyes following him, whispering, judging. It was always the same. The stares that lingered too long, the whispers just loud enough to hear. Why is he even here? He's just looking for special treatment. People like him always cause problems. Jason swallowed the familiar taste of anger and humiliation. It burned, but he pushed it down deep. Today was just another day, just another battle to survive. He paused outside room 214, bracing himself. Ms. Thompson's room. She had never liked him, that much was clear from day one. Her smiles were tight, her patience thinner than paper. Jason could always feel it. The way she spoke slower to him, sharper, like he was something unpleasant she was forced to tolerate. He hated being here, but he had no choice. The school didn't care. No one cared. Taking a shaky breath, Jason pushed the door open and stepped inside. The classroom fell silent for half a second, just long enough for every face to turn toward him, just long enough for him to feel the suffocating weight of being other. Ms. Thompson barely glanced at him before snapping. "You're late again, Jason. This is becoming a habit." Jason tried to explain, the crowded halls, the difficulty moving fast on crutches, but she cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand, dismissing his voice before it even left his throat. "Excuses don't excuse disrespect," she said coldly. The class tittered behind him, and Jason's cheeks burned hot. He stumbled to his seat, careful not to jostle Orion too much. The parrot peeped quietly, sensing his stress. Jason stroked the side of the carrier to calm him, trying to focus on the textbook Ms. Thompson slammed down on the desk in front of him. "Page 237, she snapped. "Maybe if you focused more on your studies instead of dragging your circus in here, you wouldn't be so far behind." A few students laughed openly now, not even pretending to hide their amusement. Jason's chest tightened, but he refused to look up. He could feel Ms. Thompson's eyes boring into him, filled with disdain. It wasn't just his crutches she hated. It wasn't just his parrot. It was him. His skin. His existence. The tension in the room crackled like static electricity. Jason gripped his pencil tighter, the muscles in his hands shaking, not from weakness, but from the unbearable urge to disappear. He didn't know it yet, but this day, this moment, was about to spiral far beyond humiliation. Today wouldn't just leave bruises on his body, it would leave scars on his soul. And no one in that room would ever be able to pretend they hadn't seen it. Jason kept his eyes locked on the battered pages of his textbook, pretending not to notice the way Ms. Thompson hovered at the front of the room, pacing like a lion surveying weak prey. He scribbled notes furiously, though his mind wasn't on the lesson. It never was. His focus was survival, not Shakespeare. The whispers buzzed around him like insects. "Why does he even bring that bird?" someone muttered behind him. "Maybe if he wasn't so slow, he wouldn't need a pet to do the thinking for him," another voice hissed, low enough to sound secret, but loud enough to sting. Miss Thompson heard it. Jason saw the flicker of a smirk twitch at the corner of her mouth before she turned back to the board, pretending she hadn't. Jason's fists clenched beneath the desk. His whole body vibrated with the effort of not reacting. That was what they wanted. A slip. A reason to make him the villain. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The lesson dragged on like an endless punishment. Jason felt the heat of every stare, the disdain radiating from every corner of the room. Every time he tried to answer a question, Ms. Thompson cut him off or corrected him in front of everyone, her voice dripping with exaggerated patience, as if speaking to a child too slow to understand. "Try to keep up, Jason," she said once, tapping the board pointedly. "Maybe next time, leave the distractions at home." She meant Orion. She meant his only comfort, his only friend. Jason's throat tightened. He wanted to scream, to demand why his very existence seemed to offend her so deeply. But instead, he swallowed the anger like poison, letting it burn inside him. As the minutes crawled by, the tension in the room grew almost unbearable. Jason could sense something coming, something worse than the usual casual cruelty. He could see it in the glint of Ms. Thompson's eyes, feel it in the way the other students shifted in their seats, sensing blood in the water. Finally, as Jason struggled to balance his book and his notes, his crutch slipped slightly against his chair. The noise, small, insignificant, echoed loudly in the quiet room. Ms. Thompson spun around, her face twisted in barely concealed rage. "Enough!" she barked, her voice sharp as a whip. "If you can't sit still like the rest of us, maybe you don't belong in my classroom." The room froze. Jason's heart pounded in his ears. He didn't move. He didn't dare. "Ms." Thompson stormed toward him, snatching the heavy literature book from the edge of his desk. Without warning, she hurled it directly at him. The thick spine struck his chest, knocking the breath from his lungs. A gasp rippled through the students, but no one moved. No one spoke. Before Jason could recover, Miss Thompson reached for the carrier on his backpack. Orion squawked in panic, but she ripped the door open and, with a cold, deliberate motion, flung the parrot across the room. The tiny bird hit the opposite wall with a sickening thud, fluttering weakly to the ground. Jason watched in horror, the world around him blurring and distorting, as the classroom remained utterly still. His body refused to move. His voice was trapped somewhere deep inside his chest, suffocated by the sheer shock of it all. "Ms." Thompson stood over him, breathing heavily, her hands still clenched into fists. Her face was a mask of disgust, as though Jason's mere presence was a personal affront to her authority, to her world. "You bring chaos wherever you go," she hissed under her breath, so only he could hear. "People like you always do." Jason barely heard the words. His eyes were locked on Orion, lying motionless on the tiled floor. His friend. His last tether to kindness, in a world that had none to spare for him. The silence shattered with the ringing of the dismissal bell. The students fled the room like rats escaping a sinking ship, eager to distance themselves from the scene, from the guilt, from their own cowardice. No one stayed. No one spoke. Jason sat frozen, his body numb, his soul hollow. He wanted to move, to scream, to gather Orion into his arms and run far, far away, but he couldn't. Not yet. Because in that moment, in that silent, echoing classroom, Jason understood something with a brutal, searing clarity. The world didn't just tolerate his suffering. It expected it. Jason sat alone in the abandoned classroom, staring at the limp form of Orion across the floor. His chest ached, not just from where the book had struck him, but from a deeper, older wound that words could never quite reach. He wanted to move, to stand, to gather the broken pieces of himself scattered across that polished floor. But he couldn't. The walls around him felt alive, pressing in tighter with every heartbeat, suffocating him under the weight of silence. A sharp knock on the door snapped him from his daze. The principal's voice, cold, clipped, rehearsed, called him out into the hallway. Jason forced himself to stand, each step feeling heavier than the last. As he limped into the corridor, he noticed the way other students avoided looking at him, their faces tight with a mixture of fear, pity, and disgust. Whispers floated behind him like smoke. He probably started it. It's always the same with them. Can't handle being treated like everyone else. Jason's hands trembled as he tightened his grip on his crutches, willing himself not to react. They wanted him angry. They wanted him to be the villain they already believed he was. The principal didn't bother hiding his irritation as he led Jason down the endless sterile hallway. Mr. Lawrence was a tall, rigid man who spoke only in warnings and punishments, a man who smiled only for parents who donated money, or students who made the school look good. Jason had never been either. Inside the main office, the air felt even colder. Jason was told to sit, though he noticed the way the secretary wrinkled her nose as he passed, as if his very presence tainted the air. Mr. Lawrence paced behind his desk, his face a mask of forced patience. "Jason," he said finally, his voice low and heavy with accusation. "We have a situation here." Jason said nothing. There was nothing he could say that would matter. "It's been brought to my attention that you disrupted Ms. Thompson's class," the principal continued. "You were aggressive, disrespectful, and disruptive." Jason's jaw tightened. Disruptive. Aggressive. The words felt like punches. He thought of the book slamming into his chest. He thought of Orion's fragile body hitting the wall, his fists curled on his lap, nails digging into his palms. "I understand you've been bringing animals to school without authorization," Mr. Lawrence added, his lip curling slightly at the word animals. "Frankly, it's not appropriate. It's distracting to the other students. It creates a hostile learning environment." Jason opened his mouth, struggling to find the words. Orion wasn't just an animal. Orion was his therapy companion, something the school had authorized months ago when they agreed to his disability accommodations. But as he sat there, facing the cold indifference of Mr. Lawrence, he realized it didn't matter. His needs didn't matter. His pain didn't matter. His existence was the disruption. "You'll be suspended for 3 days while we investigate the incident," the principal said, flipping through a file on his desk without meeting Jason's eyes. "Ms. Thompson will continue her classes without further distraction." The final blow. Not only had he been attacked, but now he was the one punished. Jason stared blankly at the man across the desk, realizing he wasn't seen as a student. He was a threat, a burden, an inconvenience to be managed quietly, so the school could protect its spotless image. The final insult came when Mr. Lawrence leaned forward, voice dropping to a patronizing whisper. "Jason, you need to learn how to behave if you ever hope to succeed. Life isn't going to give you a free pass just because you've had challenges." Jason bit the inside of his cheek so hard he tasted blood. He didn't trust himself to speak. Anything he said would only confirm what they already believed about him. Angry, dangerous, out of control. The secretary handed him a suspension notice as he left the office, her fingers brushing his hand for the briefest moment before she wiped them on her skirt, as if touching him had dirtied her. Outside, the hallways buzzed with life. Jason felt every pair of eyes crawling over him as he made his way to his locker. Someone snickered. Someone muttered a slur under their breath, low enough to stay out of trouble but loud enough to cut deep. He packed his things in silence, his fingers trembling. A note was taped to his locker door. No name, no handwriting to trace. Just a message scrawled in angry, jagged letters. "Go back to where you belong." Jason ripped it down without reading it a second time. He knew exactly what they meant. He had heard it before. Every step he took, every breath he drew, was treated as a transgression. He didn't belong in their schools, in their neighborhoods, in their America. As he limped through the parking lot, the sky heavy with grey clouds, Jason felt the familiar bitterness rise in his throat. He had done everything they asked, stayed quiet, worked hard, tried to be invisible, and still they found reasons to tear him down, to remind him of his place. He made it to the edge of the parking lot before he collapsed onto the cold curb, his backpack slipping from his shoulders, Orion's empty carrier still dangling uselessly from the strap. For the first time in a long time, Jason allowed the tears to fall, silent, hot, angry tears that burned his skin. He wasn't crying because he was weak. He was crying because the world had made it clear, no matter how hard he fought, no matter how good he tried to be, they would always find a way to crush him. And somewhere deep inside, buried under the sorrow and humiliation, something new began to take root. A sharp, searing rage. A promise to himself that he would not be silent forever. One day, they would hear him. Let's take a brief pause in the story. We would love to hear from you in the comments. Let us know where you are listening from and if you have ever experienced something similar in your own life. If you are enjoying the story, consider subscribing to stay with us for more. Your support means a lot. Now, Let's continue. The 3 days of suspension were not a break. They were a sentence. Jason sat at home in the tiny apartment he shared with his mother, staring at the cracked ceiling. The silence around him thick and oppressive. His mother worked double shifts now, afraid that standing up for him at the school would cost her job, and Jason was left alone with nothing but his thoughts and the broken carrier where Orion used to sit, chirping softly, comforting him after bad days. There was no soft chirping now, only emptiness. He checked his phone once, against his better judgment. His inbox was flooded. Messages from classmates, none offering support. Instead, the tone was brutal, mocking, sharp. Screenshots of group chats where his name was passed around like a dirty joke. Memes made with his face. Disabled drama king. Bird boy loses it. Every joke heavier, meaner. Jason turned the phone off and threw it across the room. But the damage was already done. They hadn't just humiliated him at school. They were trying to erase him entirely. Word about the incident had spread beyond the school halls. Parents discussed him like he was a virus, something dangerous that might infect their perfect children. In online forums filled with polished profile pictures and hollow smiles, they twisted the story. They said Jason had been disruptive for months, that he brought his Parrot to intimidate students, that he had lashed out violently at Ms. Thompson. They repeated it so many times that even those who hadn't seen anything began to believe it, because it was easier to believe the problem was Jason than to admit the truth, that the system was rotten from the inside out. When Jason returned to school after suspension, it was like stepping into enemy territory. The air shifted when he walked into the building. Conversations dropped off mid-sentence. Eyes followed him down the halls. Teachers spoke to him with clipped, hollow words, their friendliness stripped away to reveal only the raw, uncomfortable truth. They didn't want him here. At his locker, Jason found another note crumpled and stuffed through the slats. This one wasn't even subtle. "You don't belong here. Stay away before someone makes you leave." He crumpled the paper in his fist, heart pounding, forcing himself not to show weakness. That's what they wanted. That's what they expected. But inside, he was breaking all over again. In English class, Ms. Thompson wasn't there. A substitute teacher, a thin man with watery eyes and a forced smile, handed out worksheets without looking directly at Jason. But the room was full of poison. Every snicker, every sideways glance, every cough disguised as a slur was another knife twisting deeper into him. Jason kept his head down, his hand shaking as he filled in answers he didn't even care about anymore. Midway through class, someone threw a paper ball at his head. Jason didn't flinch. He didn't look up. Another followed. Then another. Laughter rippled across the room, the substitute teacher oblivious or choosing to pretend he was. Jason kept writing. He kept breathing. He refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him crack again. But it was after class, when he tried to leave, that the real humiliation came. A group of boys blocked the door, arms crossed, faces twisted with amusement. "Hey, Crutches," one of them sneered, stepping into his path. "Where's your little bird? Guess you couldn't keep even that alive, huh?" Jason's vision blurred, his breath catching painfully in his throat. Another boy chimed in. "Maybe if you weren't so useless, none of this would have happened. Maybe you should just go back to whatever gutter you crawled out of." Jason tried to push past them, but one of the boys shoved him hard, sending him staggering back against the wall. His crutches clattered to the floor, the noise sharp and final. The hallway was full of students, but no one moved to help. They simply watched, some laughing, some turning away as if the scene unfolding wasn't their business. On the floor, Jason saw their faces looking down at him, not with pity, not even with cruelty, just blank, detached indifference, like he wasn't even human. It was a familiar feeling. It was a lesson the world had been teaching him for years. People like him didn't deserve protection. They didn't deserve respect. He scrambled to grab his crutches, his face burning, humiliation choking him like smoke. He forced himself to stand, forced himself to limp past them without another word. He would not give them more ammunition. He would not feed their hunger for his pain. But every step down the hallway felt heavier than the last. The walls seemed to close in, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing like mocking laughter. Jason felt small, smaller than he ever had before, a walking target, a permanent outsider. And yet, Even as the world tried to crush him into silence, something inside him refused to die. A cold, slow-burning fury built in his chest. A fire they couldn't stomp out, no matter how hard they tried. He would not let them erase him. Not now, not ever. Jason didn't sleep that night. He lay awake staring at the cracks in the ceiling, counting them over and over, trying to drown out the hateful voices still ringing in his ears. Every laugh, every shove, every whispered slur from that day tangled together inside him. An ugly knot he couldn't untie. He hadn't told his mother what happened. How could he? She was already working herself sick trying to keep them afloat, believing that if Jason just kept his head down long enough, things would get better. But Jason knew better now. Better didn't come for kids like him. Morning came too soon, but Jason didn't skip school. Part of him wanted to stay home, to hide, to disappear. But the other part, the part that had survived every bruise, every shove, every sharp word, dragged him out the door. Let them see him. Let them choke on their own hatred when he refused to vanish. Every step back into that building was a battle. But Jason fought it anyway. The moment he walked through the front doors, he could feel it. The ripple of attention, the hush that followed him like a second shadow. A new rumor had started overnight. He heard bits and pieces as he limped past groups of whispering students. Jason attacked Ms. Thompson. Jason threatened other students. Jason brought a dangerous animal to class. Each version of the story more twisted, more monstrous than the last. The truth had been buried so deeply that even Jason began to wonder if it had ever mattered at all. At his locker, someone had left another message. This one scrawled directly across the metal in thick, black marker. Animals like you don't belong with people. Jason stared at the words, the rage bubbling so fiercely inside him, he could barely breathe. Teachers passed him in the hallway and pretended not to see. Students snickered as they walked by. Jason's knuckles turned white as he clenched his crutches tighter. The anger screamed inside him, but he kept moving, always moving. In class, the new substitute barely acknowledged him, calling roll without looking his way. Every time Jason tried to raise his hand to answer a question, the teacher's eyes slid right over him, choosing someone else instead. It was like he didn't exist. Until, of course, the jokes started. A piece of crumpled paper hit him in the back of the head. He ignored it. A whispered chorus of bird noises followed. He ignored it. Someone mimicked a parrot squawk so loudly that the whole class burst out laughing. Jason sat rigid in his seat, every muscle screaming at him to react. But he didn't. He stayed silent. Because the moment he showed anger, they would win. They would say he was out of control, violent, dangerous. During lunch, Jason sat at the farthest table, away from the cafeteria's noisy crowd. His tray of untouched food sat in front of him, growing colder by the minute. He couldn't eat, not with the glares stabbing into his back. A group of students nearby made no effort to lower their voices. Bet he thinks he's some kind of activist now. Yeah, real inspiring. A cripple with a bird. He should just go back to wherever they dragged him out from. Laughter erupted around the table. Jason's hands trembled, but he didn't move. He wouldn't give them the reaction they craved. Instead, he stared straight ahead, every heartbeat a drumbeat of pure, blistering rage under his skin. By the time the final bell rang, Jason's head throbbed with exhaustion and hate. He limped toward the exit, praying for just a few minutes of peace. But peace wasn't given to boys like him. Near the front doors, he was stopped by Coach Mercer, the gym teacher who had never hidden his disdain for Jason's special treatment. "You," Mercer barked, pointing at Jason as if summoning a disobedient dog. "Office, now." Jason obeyed silently, his legs heavy with dread. In the office, he found Principal Lawrence waiting, arms crossed, jaw tight with a kind of fury that Jason knew wasn't really about him. It was about the fact that Jason's very existence made the school look bad now. "We've received more complaints," the principal said, his voice dripping with false professionalism. "Parents are concerned. Teachers are concerned. Students are concerned." Jason said nothing. "You're a disruption, Jason," Lawrence continued. "You've created an unsafe environment. This isn't about race. This isn't about disability. This is about you not knowing your place. The words slammed into Jason harder than any shove. Not knowing your place. There it was. Naked, raw, undeniable. The truth they had all tried to hide behind rules and policies and fake smiles. Effective immediately, Lawrence said, sliding a form across the desk. You're being placed on probation. One more incident, and you'll be expelled. Expelled for daring to exist. Jason stood there, his fists clenched, every fibre of his being screaming at him to say something, to fight. But he knew it wouldn't matter. His voice had already been dismissed before he opened his mouth. Outside, the sky was dark with heavy clouds, mirroring the weight in Jason's chest. He stepped out into the cold air, the paper crumpled in his hand, the warning echoing in his mind. He was out of chances, out of allies, but as Jason stared up at the bruised sky, something in him hardened into stone. If they wanted him to be silent, invisible, broken, they were going to be disappointed. He had spent his whole life swallowing his anger, surviving their cruelty, bending under the weight of their expectations. But not anymore. If they thought they had crushed him, they hadn't seen anything yet. Jason knew there was no saving himself in their eyes anymore. No careful words, no apologies, no silent endurance could erase what had been done or what they had already decided about him. He was a threat now, a stain on their perfect polished halls. And once the world decided who you were, they didn't care about the truth. They only cared about preserving their comfort, even if it meant destroying you to do it. The next morning, Jason didn't bother with trying to blend in. He walked into school straight-backed, eyes forward, ignoring the way conversations died in his wake, ignoring the way students shifted away from him as if he were diseased. He heard the mutters, sharper now, less masked. Should have expelled him already. That's what happens when you let them in. Always acting like victims. He should have been used to it. He thought he was. But today, the venom in their voices cut deeper than ever before. He felt it in every breath he took inside those walls, every step across those gleaming floors. He didn't belong here. Not in their classrooms, not in their lunchrooms, not in their idea of what this world should look like. In homeroom, he found a note waiting on his desk. A single scrap of paper, no name, no handwriting to trace. 4 words, thick and black and impossible to ignore. Know your place, boy. Jason stared at it, his pulse thundering in his ears. He felt the heat of 100 eyes on him, waiting, watching. If he tore the note up, if he stormed out, if he said a word, they'd call him angry, aggressive, dangerous, proof that everything they said about him was true. So he folded the paper calmly, tucking it into his jacket pocket. Let them wonder. Let them fear the quiet instead of the noise. At lunch, he sat alone again. The cafeteria buzzed with activity, but around him, there was a bubble of cold, deliberate isolation. His table was a no man's land, an invisible border none dared cross. Not out of respect, but out of disgust. He picked at his food without eating, the words of the note burning a hole in his pocket. He didn't notice the boys approaching until one of them slammed a hand down on his table, knocking over his tray. Food splattered across the surface, dripping onto Jason's lap. The boy, thick-necked, smirking, leaned down close. "Don't worry," he said, his voice dripping mock concern. "You people are used to eating scraps anyway, right?" Laughter exploded from his friends standing nearby. Jason froze, every nerve in his body vibrating with rage. He could feel it crawling up his spine, urging him to lash out, to defend himself, to scream. But he didn't move. He just looked up, locking eyes with the boy, and for one chilling moment, Jason didn't see another student. He saw the teacher who had thrown the book. He saw the principal who spoke to him like dirt. He saw the system that let it all happen and called it order. He picked up his crutches, stood slowly, wiped the spilled food from his pants with cold, mechanical motions, and he walked away. Not because he was afraid, not because he accepted it, but because he was saving his fire for when it would matter. In the hallway, the walls felt closer than ever. Posters about diversity and respect plastered the walls like sick jokes, bright slogans mocking the reality Jason lived every day. He passed teachers who wouldn't meet his eyes, students who smirked at his limp. He made it through the day without another incident, but it wasn't survival. It was erosion. Every second inside those walls stripped something from him, piece by piece. That night, he sat alone at the cracked kitchen table, staring at the suspension notice and the disciplinary warnings piling up around him. His mother worked late again. She didn't know how bad it had gotten. He wasn't sure he could tell her without breaking the last little bit of hope she carried for him. But Jason knew now. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting against a world built on keeping him small, silent, and broken, and he was done being silent. He pulled out his notebook, the one he usually used for class, and began to write. Not homework, not essays, his story. Everything. The truth, the insults, the looks, the violence, the way the school twisted the narrative to protect itself, the way they used his race, his disability, his very existence against him. Page after page poured out of him like a wound finally torn open. He wrote until his hand cramped, until the words blurred on the paper. He wrote until the silence around him cracked and broke under the weight of his fury. This was how he would fight back. Not with fists, not with shouting, but with the one weapon they could never completely strip from him: the truth. The next morning, Jason made copies of his story, hundreds of them. He stuffed them into his backpack and went to school. He wasn't subtle. He slipped copies into lockers, left them on desks, tucked them into library books. He taped them to bathroom mirrors and stuffed them into teachers' mailboxes. He left no corner untouched. And then he waited. It didn't take long. By lunchtime, the school was buzzing like a disturbed hive. Students clustered in corners, papers clutched in their hands. Teachers stormed up and down the halls, trying to collect the copies, trying to erase the evidence. But it was too late. Jason's words were everywhere now. His story, his truth. And it didn't matter how fast they tried to bury it. It didn't matter how many times they screamed at him, or threatened him, or tried to paint him as dangerous. The truth was out. He wasn't invisible anymore. He was a fire they couldn't put out. The fallout was swift and merciless. By the next morning, Jason's name was plastered across every whispered conversation, every angry glance, every administrative email stamped confidential. The school was in chaos. His story had spread further than he ever imagined, not just within the walls of Jefferson High, but into the wider community. Parents were calling. Teachers were demanding meetings. The principal's office had become a fortress, guarded by closed doors and sharp, nervous glances. But none of that meant victory, not for Jason. Instead, the retaliation came harder, colder, and more personal than he could have prepared for. As Jason stepped onto campus, he immediately noticed the change. The tension was heavier, more visible, like a storm gathering just above his head. He didn't get 2 steps inside before he was stopped. Mr. Lawrence stood by the entrance, flanked by 2 security guards who had never bothered to notice Jason before, until now. "Jason Ellis," Lawrence said, his voice dangerously low. "You're coming with us." The security guards closed in, not roughly, but with that silent authority that said, "You have no choice." Jason didn't resist. He didn't speak. He followed them through the halls, feeling the students part around him, creating a tunnel of judgment. Some smirked, delighted to see the troublemaker taken away. Others stared with blank detachment, afraid to look too interested, lest they be marked next. They led him not to the principal's office, but to a conference room. Inside sat Ms. Thompson, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her lips pressed into a line of perfect, practiced victimhood. Beside her was a school board representative Jason had never seen before, her sharp eyes watching him like he was a wild animal. "Sit," Lawrence commanded. Jason obeyed, lowering himself carefully into the chair, his crutches clattering softly against the floor. Mr. Lawrence didn't waste time. "You've created an environment of hostility," he said, sliding a thick file across the table. Inside were pages of accusations, rumors, twisted versions of events carefully constructed to paint Jason as the aggressor. You've disrupted the learning environment. You've intimidated staff. You've spread false and damaging information about a respected educator. Jason's mouth was dry. He opened it to speak, but the school board woman held up a hand. At this point, young man, she said crisply, your behavior is considered grounds for expulsion. Jason's heart pounded in his ears. You are a threat to the safety and integrity of this institution, she continued. Students and teachers alike have expressed concern over your presence. Jason felt the words like blows. It didn't matter that everything he had written was true. It didn't matter that he had been the one attacked. The system was never designed to hear his voice, only to silence it. Ms. Thompson leaned forward slightly, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at her lips. We tried to give you chances, Jason, she said, her voice dripping with false concern. But some people simply refuse to learn how to behave. Jason gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. He could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on him, all the boys and girls who had been crushed under the same system, under the same lies, under the same slow, careful suffocation of their worth. I didn't lie, Jason said quietly. His voice barely carried across the table, but it was steady. Everything I wrote was true. Lawrence shook his head like he was disappointed in a child who didn't know any better. Truth, he said, is a matter of perspective. The school board woman slid a paper toward him. You have two options, Jason. You can withdraw voluntarily, and this will be kept off your record, or you can force us to expel you formally. Jason stared at the paper. The choice was no choice at all. Surrender or be branded forever. He thought of his mother, working late into the night, believing somehow that all of this would lead to a better future for him. He thought of Orion, of the soft brush of feathers against his fingers, of the one creature that had given him unconditional love when the world only gave him contempt. He thought of the kids watching him right now, in silence, too afraid to stand, too broken to hope. Jason picked up the pen. The room held its breath. But he didn't sign. Instead, he drew a heavy black line across the paper and shoved it back across the table. I'm not ashamed, he said, standing slowly. I'm not going to disappear just because it's easier for you. Lawrence's face darkened. You'll regret this, he said. Jason met his gaze without fear. I already regret thinking this place was ever meant for someone like me. He turned and walked out, the security guards flanking him but not touching him, not daring to. The halls were quieter now, but Jason didn't care about the stairs anymore. He didn't care about the whispers. He had told his truth. They could try to erase him, but they couldn't erase what had been said. They couldn't erase what had been done. And outside those walls, beyond the polished floors and the fake smiles, the real fight was just beginning. The streets didn't ask for permission to speak. The truth didn't need their approval to exist. Jason stepped into the cold afternoon air, the sun breaking weakly through the grey clouds. He was no longer the boy they thought they could crush. He was something they couldn't control. And he was just getting started. Jason didn't slow down as he walked away from the school, feeling the bitter cold whip against his face, sharper and crueler than it had been that morning, like the air itself had turned hostile in response to what he had done. He wasn't stupid. He knew what was coming next. The school would twist the story, polish it up into something palatable for the parents and the media, painting him as a dangerous influence who had to be removed for the good of the community. They would cover their crimes with smiling faces and carefully worded statements, and the world would believe them because it was easier than facing the truth that they had allowed a system built on racism and cruelty to flourish right under their noses. Jason's phone buzzed in his pocket again and again, but he didn't look at it. He didn't have to. He already knew what he would find. Messages from classmates mocking him, parents demanding he be kept away from their children, strangers telling him to be grateful he wasn't in jail where he belonged. The world wasn't afraid to be honest anymore. They didn't bother hiding their hatred now. It was raw, open, and savage, and it followed him like a second skin. By the time he made it home, Jason's hands were numb from the cold, but he didn't go inside. He sat down on the crumbling steps outside his building. staring out across the broken streets that stretched toward the horizon, wondering how far he would have to go before the world stopped trying to break him. His mind raced, burning with humiliation and fury. He thought of the boys who had mocked him, the teachers who had ignored him, the principal who had threatened him with a smile. He thought of Ms. Thompson, sitting there with her carefully constructed lies while the system bent over backward to protect her. He thought of all the people who had seen what happened and said nothing, did nothing, because to them his pain was invisible, or worse, justified. Jason pulled out his phone, opened the video app, and stared into the camera, his reflection shaky in the dirty screen. His voice was low and rough when he finally spoke. "My name is Jason Ellis, and this is what they did to me." He spoke without notes, without a script, letting every wound, every scar, pour out of him like blood from a split vein. He told them everything, about the book thrown at his chest, about the parrot hurled against the wall like garbage, about the way the administration twisted his words and painted him as a threat, about the suspension, the threats, the warnings to know his place. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He just spoke, raw and steady, daring anyone to look away. When he finished, he uploaded the video without hesitation. He didn't care if it ruined him. He didn't care if it made him more of a target than he already was. Silence hadn't saved him. Maybe the truth would. The video didn't explode immediately. It was a slow burn at first, a few shares, a few angry comments, a few people calling him a liar, telling him he was just looking for attention, just another entitled kid who didn't understand how the world worked. But then something shifted. More people started watching. People who didn't know him, who had no reason to defend him, started sharing it, started asking questions the school couldn't answer. Why wasn't there an investigation? Why was a disabled student treated with such open hostility? Why was no one being held accountable? Jason watched it spread with a numb kind of detachment. He knew the firestorm was coming. He just didn't know how big it would be. Within days, reporters started circling the school, hungry for sound bites and scandal. The administration issued hollow statements about investigations and commitments to diversity, but Jason knew better. They weren't sorry for what happened. They were sorry they had been caught. Meanwhile, the hate came faster, uglier. Messages flooded Jason's inbox. Threats, slurs, people telling him he was ruining good teachers' lives, that he was making things harder for real victims, that he was playing the race card because he couldn't handle discipline. Jason read every message. He let them carve into him, deeper and deeper, until there was nothing left but steel. He wasn't afraid anymore. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. One evening, as he walked through his neighborhood, a pickup truck slowed beside him. Jason kept walking, not looking, not reacting, until the passenger window rolled down and a bottle came flying out, smashing at his feet. A voice yelled out, full of hate, thick with venom. "Stay in your lane, cripple!" Laughter echoed as the truck sped off into the night. Jason stood there for a long time, breathing hard, feeling the shards crunch beneath his shoes. The message was clear. Stay silent, stay small, stay invisible. But Jason had already crossed the point of no return. He wasn't going back. That night, Jason went live on social media, his face tired but unbroken. He spoke not just to the people who hated him, but to the ones like him. The ones who had been pushed down, silenced, made to feel like their very existence was a crime. He spoke about survival, about dignity, about refusing to be erased. "You can beat us down. You can humiliate us. You can tell us we don't belong," he said, his voice steady as a blade. "But we are still here, and we are not going anywhere." The video caught fire. Bigger names started to share it. Activists, community leaders, even a few celebrities. Suddenly, Jason wasn't just a kid in a small town anymore. He was a symbol, a rallying cry, a reminder that the world wasn't as fair, or just as it pretended to be. But fame brought more danger. The school board launched an emergency meeting to officially expel him, citing repeated violations of conduct policy. No mention of what had been done to him, no apology, no responsibility. Jason wasn't surprised. He showed up at the meeting anyway, standing outside the building with a small group of supporters holding homemade signs. His mother stood with him, her hand tight around his shoulder, her eyes fierce. The officials refused to let him speak. They filed in past him, stone-faced, pretending not to see him, pretending he didn't exist. But outside, the cameras were rolling, and the world was watching. Jason stood in the cold, facing the cameras, facing the people who still thought they could silence him, and he told his story again, and again, and again, until no one could pretend they hadn't heard. He wasn't fighting just for himself anymore. He was fighting for every kid who had been told they were too much, too loud, too angry, too different. Every kid who had been punished for daring to exist. Jason knew they would try to crush him. He knew they would throw everything they had at him until he broke. But what they didn't understand, what they had never understood, was that Jason had already survived the worst they had to offer. He had nothing left to lose. And when you have nothing left to lose, you have everything to fight for. Jason could feel the shift in the air before he even reached the school grounds, a thick electric tension that clung to everything and everyone. The walls of Jefferson High seemed taller now, heavier, like ancient stones built to keep people like him out forever. The front lawn was scattered with news vans, cameras perched like vultures, waiting for the next scrap of controversy to fall from the sky. Jason moved through the crowd, head held high, the weight of every stare burning into him. Some faces looked at him with hope, a few with cautious admiration, but most held the same cold, hard disdain. He had known his whole life. The school had gone on full defense mode. Security guards were stationed at every entrance. Teachers wore forced, brittle smiles as they hurried students along, pretending nothing had changed, pretending the school was still the pristine, untouchable monument to success it had always claimed to be. Jason wasn't fooled. He could feel the hatred vibrating, in the floor, in the walls, in the whispers that erupted like wildfire wherever he went. They didn't see him as a student anymore. They saw him as a problem, a virus, something to be eradicated before it infected the whole body. Jason knew the board. Meeting was scheduled for the afternoon, the final nail in the coffin they were building for him. The vote was just a formality. The decision had already been made behind closed doors. He would be expelled, erased, wiped clean from the record as if he had never existed. But Jason refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him beg. He refused to let them see fear in his eyes. The principal's office sent a final cold email to his mother that morning, informing them of the hearing, using all the sanitized language they could muster. Due to ongoing disruptions and safety concerns, Jason laughed bitterly when he read it. They could dress it up however they wanted, but the truth was plain. They didn't want a black disabled kid speaking out. They didn't want anyone to remember what they had done to him. Walking through the halls that morning was like navigating a minefield. Notes were taped to his locker again, ugly, twisted things. One with a drawing of a crippled stick figure, hanging from a noose. Another that simply read, "Stay in your cage." Jason ripped them down wordlessly, his movements slow and deliberate. He would not let them see him break. But inside, the rage boiled hotter with every second. In the cafeteria, he sat alone, as usual, the chatter around him swelling to a vicious crescendo. One table nearby erupted in loud, mocking bird sounds. Jason ignored them, kept his gaze fixed on the window, on the thin grey slice of sky that seemed so far away. A piece of bread whizzed past his head, hitting the wall behind him with a wet splat. Laughter roared across the room. A teacher stood nearby, saw everything, and turned away. Jason ground his teeth until his jaw ached. It wasn't just the students anymore. It was everyone. The system itself had turned against him. The walls, the teachers, the rules. All of it built to silence boys like him, punish boys like him, erase boys like him. When the lunch bell rang, Jason rose slowly, gathering his crutches. Feeling the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on him like stones, he moved through the halls without speaking, without flinching, a phantom haunting the corridors of the school that had already decided he was guilty. By the time he reached the gymnasium where the board hearing was being held, the crowd had gathered. Some students had been pulled from class to fill the bleachers, their presence a prop, a show of fake transparency. Parents milled around the edges, faces tight with suspicion or thinly masked disgust. The board members sat at a long table at the front of the gym, their faces blank, professional, unreadable masks. Jason's mother sat alone in the first row, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Jason met her eyes briefly and nodded, a silent promise that he would not bend. Not now, not ever. Principal Lawrence took the microphone first, his voice calm, smooth, full of carefully chosen words. He spoke of disruption, of safety, of the school's commitment to a respectful learning environment. He never said Jason's name, never acknowledged what had been done to him, never mentioned the book thrown at him, the parrot hurled against the wall, the isolation, the threats, the abuse. In their version of the story, Jason was a faceless danger, a risk, a stain that had to be scrubbed clean. When they finally gave Jason the microphone, the room fell into a brittle silence. Jason stood in front of them all, crutches steady, under his arms, shoulders squared, the gym lights harsh and unforgiving overhead. He felt the weight of their hatred, their judgment, but he also felt something else. The small, stubborn fire that had refused to die, even when everything around him tried to snuff it out. He spoke quietly at first, telling them what had happened, not just to him, but to every student who had ever been made to feel like an intruder in their own skin. He told them about the book, about Orion, about the notes and the whispers and the laughter. He told them about the silence, about the teachers who saw and turned away, about the system that protected the abusers and punished the victims. His voice grew stronger with every word, rising above the mutters, above the shifting feet, above the uncomfortable glances. "You can expel me," Jason said finally. "You can erase me from your records. You can pretend I never walked these halls. But you can't erase the truth. It's already out there. And it's bigger than all of you." A few students in the bleachers stirred, some lowering their heads, others staring at him, with something like guilt gnawing at their faces. Jason turned to face the board directly, his voice cutting through the thick, heavy air. "You're not expelling me because I'm a threat. You're expelling me because I refuse to stay silent, because I refuse to stay in my place." The silence that followed was deafening, thicker than any roar. For a moment it felt like the whole world was holding its breath, but Jason knew better. He knew how this story ended. The board voted swiftly, unanimously, expulsion approved. Jason didn't flinch, didn't lower his head. He turned away from them, from the cameras, from the crowd, and walked out of the gym with his mother by his side, his steps slow but unbroken. As he passed the entrance, he saw it again. A few faces in the crowd, young, scared, but with something else flickering in their eyes now, something dangerously close to courage, and Jason realized the truth. They could expel him, humiliate him, threaten him, but the seed had already been planted, the cracks in the walls had already begun to spread, and no amount of lies would be enough to hold it all together forever. He hadn't been fighting for himself alone. He had been fighting for all of them, for everyone who came next, and they would remember, they would not forget. Jason stepped into the cold, the wind biting at his face, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled, small and fierce, because this was not the end, not even close. The days after the expulsion blurred together in a haze of cold mornings and restless nights. Jason no longer woke to the sound of his alarm or the pressure of deadlines. Instead, he woke to silence, a different kind of silence than he had known inside Jefferson High. This one, heavier, thicker, a reminder that he had been cast out, erased, deemed too dangerous, too disruptive to be allowed among them. The town turned its face away from him. Neighbors who once offered tight, shallow smiles now crossed the street when they saw him coming. Former classmates posted cruel jokes online, each meme another dagger twisting deeper into the wounds they had carved. Some whispered that he got what he deserved. Others said he had been asking for it from the beginning, a troublemaker, a problem wearing skin too dark and carrying crutches too visible for their comfort. Even the local news covered the story, framing it carefully. A controversial student removed to protect the integrity of the school environment. No mention of the book hurled at his chest. No mention of the shattered trust, the shattered bird. No mention of the long, slow violence that had been done to him long before he ever raised his voice. Jason watched it all unfold without moving. The television flickering in the corner of the living room. His mother sitting stiffly beside him, her face carved out of stone. She wanted to scream. He could feel it radiating off her like heat. But she sat silent because she had learned, just like Jason had, that screaming didn't change anything. It only gave them another excuse to call you dangerous, another excuse to crush you harder. But outside, in the streets, something else was building. Slowly at first. A handful of people standing outside the school with handmade signs. A few brave students who dared to post Jason's story again after the news outlets buried it. A teacher, one who had always looked away before, finally stepping forward to say, "I saw it too." It wasn't a revolution, it wasn't a tidal wave, but it was something. A crack in the wall, a spark in the darkness. Jason didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel strong. He felt tired, worn thin like old paper. Every time he opened his phone, the barrage of hate crashed into him anew. Slurs, death threats, messages telling him to leave town, to leave the country, to leave the world. The racism didn't even pretend to be subtle anymore. It was naked, raw, ugly. They wanted him crushed under its weight. They wanted him to disappear without a sound. But Jason didn't disappear. He didn't stay silent. He spoke at community meetings, his voice rough but unbroken. He spoke on live streams, watched by a few dozen people at first, then hundreds, then thousands. He didn't scream. He didn't rant. He just told the truth, over and over, until the truth itself became louder than the lies. There were still more who hated him than supported him. For every message of encouragement, there were 10 telling him he was worthless. For every small rally held in his name, there was a counter-protest with signs that read, "Save our schools and protect our kids," their meaning sharpened into weapons aimed directly at Jason's heart. They didn't even pretend it wasn't about his race anymore. They didn't bother hiding the hatred he had always known was there, lurking just beneath their polished smiles. One night, weeks after the expulsion, Jason stood alone in the middle of the old town square. The statue of a man most had forgotten loomed above him, casting a long shadow across the empty pavement. In his hand, Jason held a photo of Orion, the only thing left of the one creature who had never judged him, never hurt him, never asked him to be anything but himself. He looked up at the statue, at the cold, unfeeling stone face staring out over a town that had taught him over and over again what it meant to be unwanted. And then slowly, Jason laid the photo down at the base of the statue and whispered, "You couldn't kill me. You tried. You all tried, but I'm still here." His voice trembled, not with fear, but with a grief so vast it felt like it could swallow the sky. "I'm still here," he said again, louder this time, the words ricocheting off the empty storefronts, rattling in the broken windows. He didn't expect applause. He didn't expect forgiveness. He didn't expect change to come overnight, or even within his lifetime, but he expected them to remember that they couldn't erase him, to remember that even the smallest, most broken voices could carve their names into stone if they refused to bow. Jason turned away from the statue, crutches steady beneath him, and began walking back into the night. His shoulders were tired, his heart was heavy, but his steps did not falter, because Jason had learned something that no amount of cruelty could strip away. They could humiliate him. They could expel him. They could call him every vile name they could invent, but they could not define him. They could not own him, and they could not silence him. His story was out there now, sewn into the fabric of a world that would have to reckon with him whether it wanted to or not. And somewhere, someday, another kid, limping, scared, angry, would hear Jason's story and understand that they weren't alone, that survival was possible, that their voice mattered. And in that way, Jason knew he had already won. We would love to hear what you think about Jason's story. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced racism or witnessed injustice in your own life? Your voice matters here. We value each and every one of you deeply, and your experiences and opinions mean more to us than you can imagine. If you felt connected to this story, consider subscribing and leaving a like to support us and to help bring more powerful stories to light. Wishing you a strong and peaceful day ahead. If you listened to the story until the very end, leave a comment with the phrase, "My voice matters," so we know you stayed with us all the way through.